Hello, Gospel Community Group leaders. This week we are diving right into this subject of suffering. The main takeaway from this week's sermon is that Jesus is the apex of how God keeps His promises through suffering and in spite of our sin. So even though we're sinners, Jesus becomes the apex of how God keeps His promises to us when He dies on the cross in our place and experiences suffering that we can't even comprehend or imagine. Not just the pain of being nailed into the cross, because a lot of other people experience that physical pain, but the very pain and agony and suffering that was God pouring out all the righteous wrath against sinful man on Jesus Christ on the cross. We'll never be able to comprehend that. And in that suffering, Jesus, through His suffering, made it possible for God to keep His promises. It was all part of God's promises. In fact, He was keeping His promise when He did that. But it also becomes this example and this salvation. So it becomes an example of suffering to God's people. It becomes a way of saying, now we are, through the finished work of Christ on the cross, hidden with Christ in God, and so we're secure even in the midst of suffering, and on and on and on it goes. Everything that the gospel and the cross teaches us and reminds us of and makes possible for us in God's keeping His promises to us through the suffering of Jesus, and in the midst of any suffering that we go to, in spite of the fact that we are sinful people, because Jesus has, of course, made it possible for those sins to be forgiven through that finished work on the cross. So we're jumping into suffering this week. That's where we're going. And so I want you guys to bone up a little bit if you're not super comfortable with this topic. And so Appendix A has a lot of varying. Some are articles that you can read. Some are 10-minute videos. None of them are much shorter than that, because again, this is a really robust subject. Some are full-length sermons. Some are back-to-back sermons. There's a couple 20, 30-minute deals in there. But ingest as much of that as you can, especially if you feel like you need a refresher, because we're going to dive into this. What does the Bible say about suffering, and how does that impact us, and how are you suffering right now, and et cetera, et cetera. And so especially in the personal question and in the community question, we're going to be hitting really, really hard on those two things. So please check those appendix out below. Also, you'll see 3 books, one by Piper, one by J.I. Packer, one by Tim Keller, all dealing with grief and suffering and pain and loss. Those are 3 fantastic books. Please, those are new to the resources list below, so please recommend those books to your gospel community groups if they're looking to delve deeper into this subject. You can even share some of these resources on your gospel community group pages as well. Some of these videos are very compact, by people like Matt Chandler, people like John Piper, people like R.C. Sproul Jr., and others, and a lot of resources from the Resurgence. And so all those are available. So please share that on with your group. There's no possible way you're going to be able to cover this in one evening. It's just not possible. And I know some of your discussion times are around 45 minutes. Or sometimes even less, depending on how crazy the kids are or how late everybody is getting to your group. And so there's just no possible way this can all be covered. So especially if there's someone in your group who you can tell through the conversation is really battling with this issue of suffering. Either they are really in it, the midst of suffering, or they are battling with even being able to understand why God allows such things, or why such things happen. And so definitely be in mind of putting some of these resources, especially in people who are trying to understand the theology of it. People who are actually in the midst of suffering, that can be a little bit different case by case. That's actually what the community question is going to address. It's going to kind of be open discussion for, in the midst of suffering, maybe in your past or maybe in your present, what are some ways that people have approached you? What are some ways that people have spoken into your life or sat silently in your life or loved you or cared for you that have been meaningful? And how can we do those things for each other as a gospel community group? If anything surfaces in this that is an intense suffering and you're not sure how to handle it as a gospel community leader, please get with me or with Pastor Josh, and we'd love to put some resources into your hands that can help you in that. But again, just as a general rule, a lot of times, that whole speaking the truth in love thing, it's really great to reverse the love, and when the opportunities are there, really there, speak truth and gospel into people's lives in the midst of suffering. But sometimes silence is a good thing. Waiting, listening, sitting with people. The Jewish people, and I'm probably saying this wrong, we call it sitting Shiva, and that's where when someone is experiencing grief or pain or loss, that you just come into their house and you would just park it. And so that's not a watering down of the truth. There will come a time, and for some it might be sooner than others, but there comes a time when the truth of the gospel, the people who are suffering and people who are grieving must be reminded of those things. It is for their good. It is for their joy that happens. But again, these situations can vary widely depending on what type of suffering these people are going through. So as things surface, if you feel like, man, that's huge, I'm a little bit in over my head, or maybe not in over my head, but I'd love some help for how can I individually as the gospel community leader, and how can we as gospel community members help this person, walk with this person through this grieving process or through this loss or through this suffering that they're going through, please let us know, and we'd love to put any resources in your hand to help you further in that. So that's that. One other heads up, we're going to break away in the mission question. We're going to break away from planning kind of our specific missional involvement in the tri-state area to just simply pray for the lost. And so this is going to be in the kind of behind what Josh said on Sunday morning, that from now to Easter we're going to be praying that God saves people, specific people that we know. And so he asked that each person just think of somebody in their mind who's lost without Jesus, somebody who needs to be saved by the power of God. And so we're going to discuss that. We're going to ask people to name names, and then we're going to pray for those people. We're going to ask people who don't know anyone that's lost, how are you strategically going to become involved in some way to actually be meeting people who are lost? For those of you who just named somebody, how are you going to share the gospel with them? And then 2 weeks from now, we're going to follow back up, and we're going to share these stories of how did that go, or how are things going as far as that's concerned, kind of bring some accountability into that, so that we would be people who are busy telling people about the good news of the gospel, specifically between now and Easter, but obviously as a lifestyle for our whole life. So that's that. The only announcement has to do with, again, giving statements. There's just a few of those left, but again, just one more time, remind your folks that if they need a giving statement for tax purposes, that they can see me or email me or contact me in some way, and I can get that giving statement to them for tax purposes. So that's that. Again, please check out the resources that are attached to the bottom of the study guide. They're going to go a long way in helping you in the discussion of the topic of suffering. I'm hoping and prayerful that God does some amazing things, that there are people who feel comforted, there are people who feel loved, there are people that come to a new, more robust and deeper understanding of who God is for them in the midst of suffering, and come to a more deep, thankful, emotional gratitude to Jesus Christ for the suffering that he endured on their behalf. And so praying for you guys, praying that great things happen this week by the work of the Holy Spirit and the power of the gospel for the glory of God. Love you guys. Have a great week. Let me know if you need anything at all.